Again, I'll reinforce while people are getting seated that there is the availability to continue the conversation both with questions remotely and ongoing after the colloquium to help inform our report at #SharingTheHope. Also wanted to let you know again to please be sure to sign the sign-in sheet at some point before you leave so that we can make sure you receive those resources. And finally, we had talked a little bit during this program about how there are differences in between systems. Shared Hope has put together what we call a flowchart document based on Protected Innocence Challenge recommendations that will actually provide a flowchart that looks at what do state statutes actually say can happen as far as process and placement for youth in your state. So is child abuse a form, or is trafficking a form of child abuse? Is that child going to be routed through juvenile justice, child welfare, RHY, CHINS, and what does that look like? So you can grab a report on your way out, and it's also available online. But now I'll turn it over to the most exciting part of the second half of the day, which is our second panel. And to moderate that panel, I'm joined by Behsudi from KC Family Programs.
Well, good afternoon, and it's great to see so much energy in the room. Really pleased to be here. And I have the privilege of moderating a really great panel. I hope we get as much applause as last time. The pressure's on. In this panel, we're really, in the previous panel, we focused on juvenile justice and the delinquency response. Here, we're going to really, obviously there's a lot of collaboration, and that's going to be something that emerges naturally, hopefully, throughout this conversation as well, but we want to focus more on the child welfare lens and how child welfare is or is not at the table and where they might be and how they can be collaborating with other partners in this work. The panel will also so not only will they be talking about collaboration, but they'll also be identifying policy barriers and gaps in working with children and youth who are identified as trafficked or who are at risk of trafficking. So without further ado, I will introduce to you our panel. We have the Honorable Lynn Tepper, Circuit Judge from the 6th Judicial Circuit in Dade City, Florida. Dr. Allison Blake, Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Children and Family Services. Leslie Briner, Sexual Exploitation Training and Policy Coordinator from YouthCare in Seattle, Washington. Ann Wilkinson, the Coordinator of Survivor Mentor Services at My Life, My Choice, which is a program of Justice Resource International from Boston, Massachusetts. And Tammy Sneed, Director of Girls Services at the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. So to begin, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, similar to the previous panel, to spend a few minutes highlighting their role in this work and to identify what they see as a major challenge and or opportunity in this area. Following this, I have a couple of questions prepared for the panelists to respond to, but then again, similarly to the previous panel, we would like to hear from the audience, the audience here and watching live. So Judge Tepper, I'd like to start with you. If you would please highlight sort of what you're doing in this area and some challenges and opportunities to the work.
Can you hear me in the back? That's good? All right. I have the opportunity through my work in families that are in the domestic violence system, that are in the child welfare system in the state of Florida, and with the status offenders, and of course delinquency cases that cross over. As a National Council site for the Project One, where we have equal access to the courts, one judge, one family, no wrong door, it gives me a wonderful opportunity to educate my parents, to educate children, and we have stakeholders that meet every month, that is from the nonprofits to the service providers to the business community. Education is a little slow to come aboard. Delinquency is part of our communication and all of our child welfare players. And so we share education on trauma. We share education on the risks, the triggers. We work together to maximize the education. And of course, every time I see a child that I believe is at risk, which is basically any child that's in care, that's been exposed to trauma, I am always trying to send the message to them that I care, that I'm worried about them. I explain, make sure they understand what human trafficking is, what lies out there for them, what the risks are. And every single time they see me and I believe they're at risk, we're going to have that conversation. So I have the opportunity to educate. In terms of the challenges, I consider child welfare to be the perfect storm for challenges. And that is because, I mean, consider that we have children that are the victims of trauma. And we know that children who have been traumatized, if we know the ACEs study, they are ripe for becoming runaway. They are ripe for becoming engaged in sexual relations before they are 15. They are ripe for substance abuse. Wow, so now we have a child who has an ACEs exposure. They were, because of the ACEs, the frontal lobe didn't fully develop. So even though we think that we can just shake our finger at them, or their parents can, and say, don't do this, don't you know you get your fingers burnt when you stick them on through the stove, they don't understand because the higher functioning didn't develop, and we haven't nurtured it back in, so to speak, and therefore it's like, what do you mean this is going to happen to me? So I ran away. What's the problem? It is just, they don't have the same function that we do, and we have to approach them differently. They run. They're either running from abuse or they're running to love, or they are running because nobody understands them, and it's too hard to explain. And we had some very articulate speakers last time that explained there's this major miscommunication between the parents. And sometimes it's a foster parent, sometimes it's a group home, sometimes it is a family member, it is the welfare system that they're running from. They're vulnerable. They want attention. Who's out on the street? Somebody that wants to give them attention. They don't have a place to live. You want a favor? I'll give you a favor. And we all know how that all goes down. They want stuff. They want to hang out at the mall. Well, we know in 45 minutes in Seattle, Washington, they're going to be hit up to be engaged in minor domestic sex trafficking. They're on the street, so sex becomes a reality for money for them, and that's the start. We have counselors, case managers, who treat them as offenders. They forgot they were victims. And that is across the board, so they become all the more vulnerable. We have the fact that once victimized, more likely to be victimized. Group homes. Oh, please don't talk to me about group homes. We have normalcy in Florida. And normalcy in some of our group homes mean you got a friend you want to meet? No problem. See it at 1 a.m., okay? And they end up going out and somebody gets raped and there's drugs and they're adults. It's bad news. That's not normalcy. And, of course, we have the children that live in homes with parents who have paramours, which makes them ripe for victimization. So we have the perfect storm.
Thank you. Commissioner Blake, would you please follow?
I hope you can hear me. So good afternoon, and I also would like to just thank the sponsors for inviting us here today, and also Casey Family Programs, who really has helped New Jersey think a lot about what their response to human trafficking should be from a child welfare perspective, and has given us the opportunity to collaborate with some other states. So I just wanted to really make note of that. So my story, the New Jersey story, is a little bit different than some of what you've been hearing so far, in that we are a state-administered system, and under the umbrella of the Department of Children and Families, we have the Child Protection System, we have a Children's Behavioral Health System, and we also have Women's Services. And so that has created an opportunity for us to provide a continuum of care and a response and treatment system that has the potential to be very comprehensive. At the same time, we are new to this work, and so a lot of the learning that we've done is from my colleague at the end of the table, Tammy Sneed from Connecticut, and her team members, and also from our colleagues in New York City. So this is a work in progress for us, but we are a system where, so child prostitution has been decriminalized in New Jersey, and what that means is that the majority of youth that we're working with right now and that law enforcement are working with are not coming through the juvenile courts. We're not really interacting on a regular basis with probation or the juvenile courts. It's really a group process or a collaboration between law enforcement and the child protection system. And so they're not really being charged with petty crimes that often. So what's happening? We've heard a lot about the fact that the child welfare system doesn't accept referrals or requests for service because their statutes don't allow them to respond if the perpetrator is not a caretaker. Well, in New Jersey, we have, like some other states, a non-investigatory track within our system. And so while the child protection system does respond to allegations of abuse and neglect, when the parent or another family member is the caretaker, we do also have the ability to respond to a situation to do like a child welfare assessment that is non-investigative in nature. And so our response on human trafficking cases has really taken that route if the parent or a family member is not involved. And so it's difficult. We don't have good data yet. We've, as I said, done a lot of learning from Connecticut, and so we are just now this month adding codes to our hotline and our data collection system, so that in the next several months we'll be able to say, this is the number of referrals we received regarding human trafficking sex or human trafficking labor. But right now, the coding of that is kind of mixed in with other child abuse and neglect referrals. So we don't really have good data at this point in time. The other thing I would say to you is that our response, the development of our response system, is very much because we're gearing up for the Super Bowl coming in February. And so while that's a great thing, right, for the state to have a major sporting event, it has also really created heightened awareness for law enforcement, for child welfare, and for our NGO partners. And so we're really kind of racing against the clock to be ready to be able to respond to this. But as I was saying to some of my colleagues earlier today, it's November. And what we're finding is that there's been an increase in the number of FBI raids, and so we're already having to respond on a fairly regular basis when they're finding juveniles through the course of some of these raids, but those youth are not being charged. Something else I would say about what's happening in New Jersey that I think is important is we are a system that has a fairly extensive array of street outreach and homeless youth services already. And so what we've really been trying to do is link those services to the response on human trafficking. So, we do understand from some of the experts in the field that when you have shelters or street outreach programs in some of the urban centers where the trafficking is occurring, you'll hear stories of the pimps going into those shelters and, and recruiting other youth. And so we are using those services still, but we actually also are kind of taking a departure from normal child welfare practice and looking to create services in more rural parts of the state that are not on bus routes. Understanding that if these young women and young men are going to have really a good shot at survival, that we may need to find other programs that are away from the incidents where they're being trafficked. So for us, in the southern part of the state, we have Atlantic City. There's a very large casino industry there. That's kind of a hotbed for this activity right now. There's a lot of law enforcement investigation and raids going on. And so we're trying to move the youth out of there when we can and find safer places for them. Something else that I think is really important is that we're also a system where our statutes have been changed, and so we serve youth up until the age of 21. And when law enforcement is picking up young women or young men who are between the ages of 18 and 21, because we also have women's services and the behavioral health system, we're able to kind of bypass incarceration and offer them other resources. So I think a lot of folks that have been here throughout the day have talked about the domestic violence system's response in this work. And so that's an area, that's a very strong partnership for us as well. And for some of those young adults between 18 to 21, if they can't go into a child welfare placement or receive child welfare services, we in New Jersey have been able to direct them into the adult women's services system through the domestic violence shelters or other adult services through the Polaris Project. So it's a work in progress. We're feeling fairly positive about it. I think that the biggest challenge for us right now is, I'll use different language than has been used by others, but this is really, it's a practice change for us, right? It's really changing the culture about how we work with adolescents and youth. And so, and I think that, whether we were talking about human trafficking or just working with youth at risk overall, our practice with them really needs to change. And so I think that is the biggest obstacle, both for the child welfare system and for law enforcement, how we interact with them, to really think about them as victims and move them to a place where we can help them get strong again and be safe and address their needs in a more comprehensive way. But that's our biggest challenge, I think.
Great, thank you. And Leslie, could you talk about your perspective from YouthCare?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. YouthCare is the Pacific Northwest's oldest runaway homeless youth provider. We've been providing services in the Pacific Northwest for about 40 years. And working with runaway homeless youth, we see these young people every day and have for the entire time that we've been in existence. But it was really a refocus in 2009 where YouthCare sort of took on the issue of sexually exploited youth in a more dedicated way. And what we've built out in the last several years is really a specific continuum within our larger runaway homeless youth continuum. So at this point, we have everything from street outreach that's working specifically in areas where we know youth are at risk, also specifically with boys and transgendered youth, of whom there are many, many in the runaway homeless youth population in the Seattle area. Shelter, basic needs, case management, education. We have a GED program. We have an interagency high school. We have 5 employment training programs. And then a number of housing programs, both long-term transitional living programs and emergency shelter for both under 18 and over 18 to 24-year-old young people. And so the art of this has been trying to figure out how to build dedicated services and an agency with a larger runaway homeless youth infrastructure at both the really kind of micro practice level up to the funding levels, up to the larger structural levels. And so at this point, our understanding is that these young people need a whole host of services, right? And whatever the mix or the blend is going to be different for each young person. So we're trying to, instead of just focusing on the safe house model or just focusing on these other specific pieces, to step back and look at any service that they need through the lens of sort of 3 primary pieces of learning. And the first is that the relationship is the intervention, right? Whether or not it's an advocate or a mentor or someone in their family or whoever, that relationship is the primary thing that is going to bring them in to create the engagement that will then be the sort of the gateway to whatever services they need. The second piece is that they need to detach from the subculture of either prostitution or street life. And I think Tina put it in a really great way. They talk about transitioning out of the mindset of the life, and when we use the language of subculture, but it's not just about the trauma. It's not just about the relationship to the perpetrator, but it's also that there's a subculture out there and that people attach to that. And so using a subculture-informed approach, and that's everything from money to dress to what a cell phone means to what your social networking profile looks like. It's in many ways, to me, the sort of nitty-gritty of the day-to-day skill building and teaching and unlearning that needs to happen. And then the third component is what we refer to as reframing the economic strategy. We look at the prostitution of children as being this sort of aberrant thing and this very violent and traumatic thing, which it is, but for folks in the life, it's also just an economic strategy. And sadly, you cannot unlearn this, right? You can't just excise it out of a young person's brain and expect them to just continue moving forward in some sort of normalcy. So we really focus on employment training as being a huge part of that, and that those sort of lessons learned then are applied across the continuum. So every staff across the agency has been trained. We see about 2,000 unduplicated youth a year. A number of them either have been formally sexually exploited or are engaging in survival sex or are at risk. But we understood that this is a very homogeneous group, and this is really a pretty homogeneous set of circumstances, heterogeneous, and that we need to have a really complex set of interventions that can address that. So the most recent piece has been our statewide protocol led by the Center for Children and Youth Justice, and it was at that point where I think the child welfare response really kind of came to the table. And I will say, with all due respect to the child welfare folks in the state of Washington, they really were the last to the table. This effort was led mostly by law enforcement out of Seattle PD and the FBI and the service providers, and then juvenile court judges came on board, and some of our DVSA providers came on board, and child welfare most recently with the implementation of the statewide protocol. But we do have it. We broke the state down into a number of regions. We have multidisciplinary teams. Everybody has received a basic 16-hour training and technical assistance that was provided in partnership with YouthCare. And we're going to see what happens. We're going to try, but we understand that a multidisciplinary team approach also has to be super individualized. There's not going to be any two same MDTs because no two case looks the same. And that going back to that piece about relationship building, I've been in some family team decision-making meetings, or FTDMs we call them, where you got 15 people in the room, and it looks like it's really resource-rich and service-rich, and folks are, well, we've thrown every service we can at them. And then I ask a very simple question is there anyone in this room that this young person will call when she's in crisis? Right? That's the level of assessment that we need to be doing. It's not how many referrals you've made. It's not how many times you've tried to open the door. It's, is there a relationship that young person will reach out to when they need? That needs to be the bar at which we start. And I know I'm out of my 5 minutes, so I'll get this out quickly. We sadly are still one of those states where the child welfare charter is defined by parental or caregiver abuse. We are working very hard to figure out how to change that. Our neighbors to the south in Oregon have the same language, but they took a different interpretation and said if a child is found to be being commercially sexually exploited, there's either evidence of neglect or so I think that we've seen some creative ways around that, but we are looking at a legislative fix for that in 2014. And then the last thing I want to say, just kind of the 30,000-foot level is, as a field, we're going to have to decide who's going to be accountable for this issue, right? This has been a criminal justice response, historically speaking. And there is certainly a role for law enforcement. There's definitely a role for juvenile justice. But in the end of the day, it's got to live somewhere, right? It has to live. There has to be some accountability at a structural level. And I'm not sure child welfare is the answer. I'm not saying that I have the answer for that. But if we're truly going to move to a victim-centered approach, we've got to figure out where this lands at a structural level and then create the support and training and sustainable practices within that. And right now I feel like the reason these young people so systematically fall through the cracks is because there's, we're doing this and we're putting round pegs in square holes and, trying to create Band-Aid solutions. And that level of structural thinking really needs to happen so that we can come up with something that is not only makes sense, that is trauma-informed, that is victim-centered, but that really reflects our values about how we think that vulnerable and at-risk youth should be treated.
Thank you. Anne?
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Wilkinson. I'm from My Life, My Choice in Boston, Massachusetts. And our response to children being identified is kind of three-pronged, what we do at My Life, My Choice. One, we provide trainings in the community to law enforcement, to, providers, everyone pretty much. And we have a national training component to our program where our executive director and associate director are kind of all over the country providing training. And we believe that educating the providers is really important. And then we have a prevention component, which we have a 10-week group that we run in schools and group homes and DYS facilities, kind of everywhere. And in that, we hope to educate young people so that they would know the tactics of an exploiter, and they would be able to recognize and hopefully prevent more young people from being exploited. And then the final component is our Survivor Mentor program, which is most effective. All of our mentors are survivors, and they are paired with a young person. The good part is that it's there. The bad part is, as we educate everybody, we get an overwhelming bunch of referrals, and we don't have the barrier is having the funding to have enough mentors to help these young people. But I don't need a whole 5 minutes. That's pretty much my stuff in a nutshell.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I oversee Girl Services for the Department of Children and Families for the state of Connecticut, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Connecticut has evolved to address domestic minor sex trafficking. We started our efforts in early 2008. One of my colleagues who really led the charge got a call. There were some concerns from the FBI that they were going to do a raid, and they likely were going to pick up some young people from other countries. he pulled together a small team and actually developed a protocol pretty quickly, saying this is what we were going to do when we had to pick up these young people. At the same time, there was a group of us looking at our young people, particularly girls, that were running away from home, from foster homes and congregate care, and trying to understand what was happening to these girls while they were on the run, why were they running, and what were some of the interventions that we could implement for them. The raid occurred, there were no young people under the age of 18, but at the same time we started being educated by various folks in the community, Center for Children's Advocacy, that commercial sexual exploitation of children existed in the U.S., existed in Connecticut. So that's really where we started. Since then, we have expanded the team that I mentioned. We now have what we call our HEART team, Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team, and it's a large multidisciplinary team. We have psychiatry, medical, psychology, legal, and we meet on a regular basis to talk about large system issues. Originally, my colleague and I would review every case that came into the system. As our training efforts increased and our numbers increased, we implemented what we call our mini HEART teams in each of our 6 regions. So now we have folks that are trained in the regions. Those cases are managed on a regional level. Makes sense, that's where our young people are, that's where the communities are, and our larger HEART team remains focused on the system issues. In Connecticut, and you've heard this a couple of times, we accept all cases into our care line for any young person that's been possibly trafficked. They do not have to have the identified perpetrator, be a parent or guardian. That allows us to respond to that young person. We respond within 2 hours, and it allows us to continue to provide services no matter where that young person hits our system. We now have what we call our practice guide, and I will tell you that we're always willing to share. We want folks to be able to skip a couple of the steps that we've had to take over the last few years. But we have a practice guide, which really is a roadmap. It was developed by one of our lead psychiatrists on how to respond to young people that are victims. The key to our work over the last few years has been collaboration. We work closely with FBI, local law enforcement, our providers, Love 146, JRI, My Life, My Choice. There's a number of folks, both in Connecticut and around the country, that we collaborate with. We have significant trainings in our state. We have a terrific training academy. We have 2 full days of training on trafficking. We also have a 2-hour orientation that we do most often in our community. We have trainers across the state. All our social workers, parole officers, probation officers, police, emergency departments, EMS have been trained in this area. We are now in our final stages of a new curriculum that covers boys. It's been difficult because I've had requests from boy providers that say, you know, can you come in and give us a training? And I've been hesitant because I didn't feel that our training was covering the unique needs of our young boys. So we're about there, probably in the next 4 weeks. We also are getting ready to finalize our foster care model. We've worked with 3 terrific private organizations in the community, one of them JRI, and we did a very lengthy process where we spent 2 days doing trainings for all of their workers. We did a 2-day training on how to work with girls, and then we did focus groups with foster parents. And what we asked was to foster parents is, what would you need to work with these young people? What kind of resources, what kind of supports? And what we're asking foster parents is a very long-term commitment. We know these young people run, we've heard that. It takes a lot of time to develop relationships, which is most important for these kids. So we want foster parents that are in it for the long run. Case analysis and data. I mentioned that through our care line, we accept all cases, and through that process, we're able to capture data. In addition, we have a psychologist who's just phenomenal. She reviews every single case, and she coordinates with the regions. And in that way, we're really able to dive down into the dynamics of each of these young people to learn to develop a system. And I actually think the two most important areas that we're doing right now, the department overall, and not just for trafficking victims, has implemented TDMs, team decision making. And that brings the young person to the table in his or her planning. That is key. Folks at the earlier panel talked about you can't mandate, if she says this is not something she's going to do, she's not going to do it. If we have her at the table helping us make decisions, she's most likely going to comply, if that's the word we need to use. We have a service provider network. We have not received any additional dollars for this work to address this issue. So our approach has been to train up our service providers throughout our system. And our service providers have been amazing. They've all been trained in CSEC. They all have a very strong trauma foundation. We have a very large trauma grant that we've been working with. We also provide TFCBT at many of our programs. And we also have a new curriculum called Understanding Girls. And that is a 2-day training. It was designed in conjunction with two terrific people, one of our psychologists for our department and then a private provider director in the community that operates a girls facility. And it has 5 modules. And within that training, we talk about development, which we talk about brain development, adolescent development, emotions, relational aggression. We hear about bullying. This is kind of the female version. Sexuality. And then self-care. And when I say self-care, it's not just about the young person's self-care. It's about the person's providing the support to these young people, whether it be mentors, foster families, congregate care settings. So really, in short, what I want to stress today, it's about collaboration. It's about sharing. We have not done this alone. My colleague who started this a few years ago has been terrific engaging folks from day one, and we continue to do so. We have strong partnerships. We couldn't do it without these folks. And these kind of events really help pull things together.
Great, thank you. So, Tammy, you mentioned that, and this was a theme among all of the panelists on this panel and previously, that collaboration is key, and it came up in different ways. So I'm wondering if you could start by sort of describing what you've found are the necessary resources to promote positive collaboration, maybe some lessons learned along the way, or what you find is a critical component to really, whether it's the heart team or the team decision making, what is it that promotes that positive collaboration?
Well, I think it's both, but I also want to add it's also our young people. So I do, in conjunction with a few other folks, our director of all our out-of-home care, we do some focus groups with kids across the state to hear from them. I have a small advisory board that I work with. So they, too, are helping us make these decisions. But law enforcement has been key here. And it's been important as a child welfare agency for the child welfare agency to be able to respond to law enforcement when they reach out to us. So if they bring in a young person, they're not going to arrest him or her. But you can see the frustrations build if we're not prepared to respond. And that's why we have that benchmark of responding within 2 hours. Now, I don't promise that we're going to be able to bring this young person into a particular place. All will be well, and they'll never see her on the streets again. That's unlikely. But through the training, we have a 2-hour post-certified training for police officers, so they actually get credit. We teach them to understand what these young people have gone through. And I will tell you, I get calls from police officers. I had one 2 days ago where they're very worried about the kids. They're looking for the kids all hours of the night. They're going to see the kids while they're in homes, while they're in group homes, to talk to them, to try to engage them. So it's really about being in this together. So the more we do that, I think the better, Lauren. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. Judge Tepper, I was wondering if you could answer the same question. So what is it that's needed for what is it that promotes positive collaboration in terms of who might need to be there, what sort of ownership is needed, shared ownership, things like that?
What I found is key is always having open ears and an open door, and inviting anybody to invite anybody that they know that may be interested, and so that everybody has an opportunity to have a voice, share their ideas, and we all learn together. And we are always asking ourselves, who are we missing? Even though we seem to have everybody at the table, who else can we get? You know what? You're right. We do need that person, and trying to bring them into the fold. It is hard to have participation by the families. I have good relationships with the families that have made it out of the child welfare system. I try to get them on board, but their lives are always sort of borderline on trying to struggle to survive, that I don't get their participation directly with the group. And there's also a lot of intimidation involved with that. But that's what I find, is to have people that have an open heart and an open mind and want to be educated or realize that they need further education.
Thank you. And so Anne and Leslie, you both mentioned very specifically that relationships are the intervention, and that's critical. And I think we've heard a lot about that. I was wondering if both of you could sort of go a little bit deeper and say, like, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? How can we promote that? What are the barriers to getting more of that if we don't have enough, which it sounded from both of you like we might not have enough of that. So Anne, if we could start with you.
I think that with the collaborations, what happens for us when a child is identified, exploited, there's an agency, one of the agencies we work closely with is called the SEEN Coalition, Support to End Exploitation Now. The coordinator of that project connects with 35 agencies across Massachusetts, and she will pull together all of us together. And we may not be able to physically meet, but we will make a conference call, and we will talk about services for that young person. That's really crucial too. Also, we work closely day to day. We may get a referral from the Human Trafficking Unit, and let me just give you the picture. The Human Trafficking Unit is here, My Life, My Choice is here, and SEEN is here. Our offices are right next door to each other, and we work in a building called the Family Justice Center. And we work very closely together to address the needs of the young person. But I think before we can talk about collaboration and how important that is, but you've got to be creative in how you reach the young person and the family. It's very rare for me that I don't talk to the family.
Yeah.
Whoever that might be. It may not look like what it looks like for some people, but I want that person to know that we've got your child. We're working with your child. It's not a thing. It's it's a family. And they're in trauma, not just the young person. The whole family has been affected. So just being able to work with everyone. So when I meet that young lady, I want to know what she thinks about, her caregiver. I want to know what she thinks about her DCF worker. I want to know what she thinks about law enforcement. If she doesn't want to talk to a law enforcement person, you are not going to talk to her. Because I got to protect this kid from where she's at. It's enough is enough. I know we all have our jobs. I know it's very important, but it's really important to save this young person. And so day to day, we work with a lot of different agencies, and I think, again, the barrier is education. If the folks that we're working with have not been educated on exploitation, then they're not going to know how to work with this young person. And so that's crucial. Everybody needs to understand what we're dealing with, right? And someone mentioned before culture, and you have to kind of sit back for a minute and try and find out about that young person's culture. Where is she from? What's she like? Because you can say something really simple thinking, and you totally alienated her. You have to be really mindful of where she comes from.
Thank you.
In many ways, I think that understanding relationship and engagement is kind of the $60,000 question, $60,000 question here, because I do, like I said, I do think relationship is the intervention. And there's, I think, a number of ways to think about this, because there's the relationship that a single provider, advocate, mentor, survivor, whoever has with a young person, but then there's all of these other relationships surrounding that nexus that also kind of have to work together. And so I'm going to comment on a couple of different levels. And I'd say that the very first thing regarding engagement and relationship with young people is understanding and dispelling any judgment that you have walking in about who that kid is, why he or she is out there, what the circumstances that led them out there. And anybody sitting in this room that thinks that they don't have beliefs and biases about the commercial sex trade, I would respectfully say to you that you're wrong. We all have it, no matter how much training we have. I mean, survivors have a slightly different lens because they've walked the walk, of course, but for those of us who are non-survivors, we really have to do our own work to understand and to, dispel our beliefs and attitudes so that we can come in a really therapeutic, non-judgmental, open, compassionate place. And then the follow-up piece then is to not take things personally when the youth takes off or doesn't do what we think is in their best interest. And I've found myself saying to staff over the years, surrender is the hardest part of this job, right? Unless you are willing to lock a kid up against his or her will, which there are sometimes good reasons to do that. Not that I love that as a primary strategy. There are sometimes reasons that can be helpful. But you have to be willing to sit with the uncomfortableness and the tension and the heartbreak of having them walk out the door and knowing that they're walking back into the lion's den, right? And that's about how we do our work and how we train and support one another. I would also say that I like to use the freeway metaphor, right? So going, again, to how we collaborate and have relationships among ourselves. When you're driving, you've got your focus, but you also have to pay attention to where the other cars are on the road. So I say to advocates and law enforcement and DSHS, you got to stay in your lane, right? You got to pay attention to what everybody else is doing, but you got to stay in your lane. I do not go out and investigate cases, just like I do not expect law enforcement to come in and provide social services. So you really have to have a clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are and where the touch points and the tension points are going to be. I guarantee you that in any multidisciplinary team approach, confidentiality is going to be a rub. Advocates always, mentors, whoever's always have more information. We always have the most, especially if we're doing our jobs well. We tend to have a lot of information about what's going on with the young person, and sometimes we have a release of information to share that. Sometimes it makes sense to share it. Sometimes it absolutely does not make sense to share it. But I think the thing that helps foster that kind of collaboration is, having some successes, right? Getting some good casework under your belt. And how I know things are going well in a multidisciplinary team is when the youth walks in and says, I want to call Detective so-and-so. Where is he? To me, that's a great sign. Because it's not just about the relationship with the primary person, but it's also with the detectives, with the DSHS worker, with the probation officer, with the, even with judges. And we all have our own little role to play in that, but we really have to kind of have both a micro understanding of what's going on with that young person as well as the bird's eye view of what's going on either within a multidisciplinary team or within the system at large. And I would also say that using and accessing and supporting survivor leadership wherever possible, especially in that front-end engagement, always should be a priority, regardless of what your philosophical approach is. I've known a lot of people to do this work, and nobody does it like survivors do it. So, say that.
To add to that, the relationships and building relationships. It was said earlier, you have to listen, and we can't be cross-examining children that were on the street because that's not listening. And we truly have to find out, what can I do for you? What do you need? And they may not even understand what they need, but it may be that now as I get them, they come back, just like you're saying, it's very disappointing when they leave, but I make sure that I'm not being judgmental, I'm being encouraging, so that when they come back, they know that they're not going to get attitude, that we still want to help you. Please come back, we care. But finding out that as they get older and they decide that maybe they'd like to get out of the life and they've been out of school for a year, that what they want to do is to start getting back into education, but now they're 2 years behind or get into the workplace. And we just had it recently, a young woman who's been running the streets off and on for years, always in touch with the trafficking task force down in the Tampa area, which is full of strip places and horrible clubs. But she's covered in tats now. She's branded here, she's branded here, she's branded. She's got tats and branding everywhere. And she's finally staying put for a while. When she went out for a job interview, the case manager that took her, even though she looks like a young executive woman at the moment, except for all the tats. Mm-hmm. And they said that they could see the manager of the Arby's look at her and just eyes follow all the tats, and that interview was over. Now, so you ask, what do we do for collaboration? Well, we need people to remove tattoos. And we need to, the sooner the better. So there is outreach now within the community, and we have wonderful nonprofits. So we have nonprofits in our area, like the Junior League is amazing. The Seropatists, they do things. And so when we ask our recovered children, what is it you need? Then we need to be able to respond and have those items available. If they need to know how to do an interview, that's a mentoring, which is a little different than a survivor mentor. It's going to take a variety of mentors because we don't have enough mentors. If we have, I used to get appalled at the clothing that I would see come into the courtroom from the girls, young women who had been running the street. And I decided to stop saying anything about it, and I tried to focus on the positive. And I would find out later because somebody would say, I can't believe they came dressed like that, and I had to ask about it. Well, that's all they had. They only have ridiculously sexually explicit or exposing clothing, and so they're wearing that dress with a slit up the front. They're wearing that sleeveless, strapless outfit trying to go to school or go to a class like that. So we have to recognize what's behind it and not be stereotyped, not jump to conclusions. Again, ask, form a relationship. Because as the girls, and at the moment I am only aware of girls, if I'm still open-minded, I know there are boys out there that are sexualized and have been victimized. But then when they come back in, they remember the good and the bad of what they heard from me, what they heard from the probation officer, and they're going to say, I can't believe that officer, if they were arrested for a criminal offense, not prostitution, yanked those covers off of me. Don't they know I was sexually abused? And that's, of course, a lack of education. But I had to hear that to then go get the education in the detention center. Or because I decided to be positive instead of just screaming at leaving me all the time. And I said, well, you know what? You have a lot you told me you'd like to write. You have a lot to say. You have a voice. You have a story to tell. Please, I look forward to reading your book one day. And I gave her a book on writing styles. Now, when she was younger and running, I gave her a book and she tossed it. So when she came back yet another time, she said, by the way, Judge, I still have your writing book. I still want to learn how to write. And then it was followed up with me sending her yet another book and things like that. But those little things matter, and that's the relationship that will maybe next time, like, knock on wood, stay a little longer this time. Reach out to that detective, reach out to this worker, reach out to the nonprofits to help meet their needs, not what we perceive their needs are. And when they're ready for services, that's the other thing. Who wants to talk about all that stuff? So we have to keep offering and not force it.
Thank you. Commissioner Blake, could you respond to this as well, please?
I just wanted to say something about law enforcement and their role. One of the things that we've found is that there's an incredible desire with these cases. Everybody really wants to kind of step up and do the right thing. At least that's what we're experiencing in New Jersey. And we're working primarily with the FBI, but they're victim specialists. And I think that they also are part of the relationship that we're all talking about. I mean, so, my staff are doing case management. They're connecting these youth and their families to services. But what we're finding is that it's also the law enforcement personnel who are, really out on the street, right, seeing these kids night after night who are saying, do you know you can get your case reopened? Let me help you make that phone call. If we take you to the shelter, we get you connected to the service. You can go back to school. I'll come and pick you up if you need transportation. I mean, so I just think that this is a very unique approach to working with these youth, because it's not just a traditional NGO or a child welfare system. Really, all the people at the table are trying to be part of the solution and are really, I think, getting to know these youth on a very personal level and trying to connect them to services.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll start opening up to questions from the audience. We have moved the microphone just to the back and to the side right there, but we'll also be taking questions from Twitter as well. And could you please introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Sure. My name is January Contreras, and I am with Project Always in Phoenix, Arizona. My question is, coming from Arizona, we're in our CPS child welfare system. They're in the newspaper every day, backlogs, for neglect, abuse. So it's very hard to catch their attention, to focus on girls, on sexual exploitation, on trafficked victims. And I understand what they're saying when they say, you know, we have fire coming at us all the time. We can't focus resources on this. So, you know, I think it's similar for the courts as well. So how would you suggest going about a dialogue with state agency leadership, especially in a state that can be a little conservative, and, you know, it's hard to address the realities that we're discussing here. You know, how would you approach them? What do you see in terms of ideas that would help them make room to focus on the people that we're talking about?
Commissioner Blake, do you want to
Yes,
respond
so
to that, and Tammy as well?
So I think there are community partners in New Jersey that would say that they had that conversation with me and my staff about a year ago, and we called. What I'm going to tell you is, you know, we called our colleagues in Connecticut because we heard they were doing really good work, and I think the reality for the child welfare system is that these are children and youth who are already known to us. You know, over the last several months, we've had so many law enforcement raids, and I wish I could tell you that when we look those youth up in our system that they didn't have prior CPS involvement, but the reality is that the majority of youth who are involved in trafficking have prior victimization. They have so much unresolved trauma, you know, and so it really, they were youth who were already known to us, who were running from our programs, and so I think that was really an eye-opener for us in New Jersey, and it turned out to be very true. And so the reality was we were working with them already. Maybe not doing it very well, but we were working with them already.
I actually, interesting enough, I spent my adolescent years in Phoenix, and it's great state, great city. I think the key is to find a champion. You know, I can look back, you know, several years ago, and I can name very clearly several people that just wouldn't stop. And once you can find an in, and once you're able to really talk about who these kids are, again, most of these kids are ours, they get it. Same with law enforcement. You know, law enforcement will tell me, you know, you got 10 minutes for roll call to educate us on this issue. I've never walked out before 45 minutes. You know, once you can tell them who these kids are, and sometimes you need a survivor to be able to say what they need to hear. That is often the most powerful. So you just have to find an in, and I think we can do it just about anywhere.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to respond, or move to our next question?
Yes, this is actually a Twitter question.
Okay.
So, from one of our viewers online. The question is, if a youth runs from a child welfare placement and ends up in a runaway and homeless youth program, does that cause problems for funding?
I think that's for me. Yeah, and I'm really grateful that question came up because it was the one thing I didn't get to in my opening remarks that I knew I needed to. So thanks there, Twitterer. So there are issues for runaway homeless youth agencies. In the Runaway Homeless Youth Act that all RHY agencies receive some funding through, it is specifically stated that RHY funds are not to be used for youth who are otherwise system involved. And so that means involved in the child welfare system or within the juvenile justice system. So we have this barrier, really high-level structural barrier, where even though youth are running from care or running from probation or running from whatever it is they're running from, we can't technically serve them using runaway homeless youth funds. So it creates a system by which we have to be able to braid together other sorts of funding, generally private funding, in order to be able to serve them. Now that being said, we did receive one of the first pilot grants through RHY that went into our residential recovery program, and even within that, there was issues serving youth and finding youth who would be eligible for those particular beds, because the vast majority of these youth are system involved. It's very rare actually to come across a youth who's been in the life for any period of time who has not touched any system. It happens every once in a while, but it's certainly not something that is frequent enough that funding structure should be structured around that. So one of the things that YouthCare has advocated for at the national level is revision to the Runaway Homeless Youth Act that would allow us, under certain parameters, to serve youth who are system involved using RHY funds.
Thank you. Oh, sure, please.
For the youth that run and they get picked up for a delinquency offense and they're in the child welfare problem. For instance, in Florida, they're always running to Orlando. They run to the beaches and they get picked up for misdemeanor charges. We've developed a program. We have notices that we send out, notice of dependent child, and where we either know where they were picked up or we suspect they were picked up, so that it goes out to the judges that are in that area and to the individuals in delinquency that may run across them, so that they know that's our child and we want that child back. We want the child back. I want disposition of that delinquency case, but I also need that child back because it's a child welfare case. I also have, based on relationships with, we have a good electronic notification system through the judges, through the Florida National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and we can write to anybody. So we're constantly saying, by the way, I got one of your kids today. What do you want me to do? Or send it back, or and so that is very helpful as well. But we don't want these children to get lost down the delinquency rabbit hole of saying, oh, it's just a petty theft, let's just take care of it, let's not look into their background adequately, and then we're losing an opportunity.
Thank you. Our next question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Sandler. I'm an assistant prosecutor in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in Newark, New Jersey. So I'm sitting on the subcommittee that's developing the human trafficking multidisciplinary team guidelines for our state with many of Dr. Blake's colleagues. And I'm wondering, for the states that do have that in place, if there's any tips that you have that have really been striking and have really assisted in you implementing a human trafficking track of your MDT process that I could bring back to the group on next Monday.
I will say quickly that the Washington State Model Protocol for Sexually Exploited Youth is available online in PDF, so you're welcome to read it. And if you come to me, I can send it to you directly.
Tammy, do you want to respond?
Real quick, I just assumed responsibilities of all the MDT teams in Connecticut on July 1, and I've met with them across the state, and they're a terrific group of folks, and they are more than willing to work with this population, but we are just getting there with our MDT teams. So probably next year we'll be prepared to share our efforts.
Good, great. Thank you. Our next question, please.
Hi, my name is Richard Menzies from Practical Solutions to Trafficking, and I heard earlier on talking about the importance of job training, and we do have the Federal Workforce Investment Act type individual training accounts. I'm wondering, have these victims and survivors been able to access those, and what has been the hurdles if they haven't?
Anne, do you want to respond, or who?
As far as jobs, do you mean are there jobs in place or services
No,
in place?
the Workforce Investment Act and its follow-on legislation creates funding for job training.
Okay.
And it's implemented as an individual training account, which is a certain amount of money that they can then spend on as a voucher they can give to a training provider. And they have, former homemakers who are returning to the workforce can access this, but are trafficking victims able to?
I haven't seen that.
Okay.
We are creative in helping our girls, just getting them trained in understanding interview techniques. Oh, I'm sorry. Getting them trained, understanding interview techniques and stuff like that. I hope I'm not wrong, but I don't think we have funding for that I'm aware of. We are really creative in helping them go on interviews, and we have collaborations with certain agencies that will hire a girl who has been exploited, but that's like 2 agencies.
Okay. Dr. Blake, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I can't really speak to the funds that you're talking about, but for youth who are involved in the child welfare system, for youth who are involved in the child welfare system, they can access both job training and also educational funding, right? So one of the reasons we encourage them to keep their case open is so that they can go back to school, whether it's a technical school or or college or university, and so if they do have an open case, they are getting hopefully that full array of support around both education and training.
And YouthCare actually does receive WIA funding. So WIA funding does, or Workforce Investment Act funding does go into some of our job training programs. And so it is accessible in that way, although, again, it's kind of blended into specific employment training programs that we have. I'd say one of the potential barriers in there has to do with what outcomes are attached to it. So if you could say the same thing about some HUD funding and other types of funding where if the outcome has to be that the youth is going to be stable in placement for 6 months and is engaged in case management once every month, and those things that we know do not necessarily fit with this population, then the outcomes that are attached to certain funding streams can be a barrier for serving victims of trafficking. But we're very grateful to have the WIA funding that we do, and I think that one of the things we do really well is this robust employment continuum that we have. So we would love to see some tweaks to make it a little more accessible, but we're grateful for what we have.
Great, thank you. Our next question, please.
Hello, my name is Ian Kitterman. I work with a group called the Renewal
Could
Forum.
you lean into the microphone just a little more? Thank you.
My name is Ian Kitterman. I work with a group called the Renewal Forum. I hope my question's not too duplicative of the first one, but when I work with Child Protective Services and I talk about this and I work with them, I hear two things. First, we don't have this problem, and that even happens in places like Florida when I talk to them. And or the other issue is we have this problem, but I don't want to hear about it and I don't want to know about it because I don't have the resources to do anything about it. So how have you guys overcome those challenges, and how would you respond to either of those answers?
Well, our state, Connecticut, has we have this problem. We've identified the kids, and we're determined to respond to the kids. And we haven't used money as an excuse. Would I love money to create some very special services for this population? Sure. But it's not an excuse not to do what we can right now.
So I would say also we have this problem, and I think the struggle for us is just to develop, to run fast enough to develop the services that are needed. We have a very large children's system of care, which is a behavioral health treatment system, and it's kind of a full continuum, and it's Medicaid funded. And so if they're either receiving treatment services through that side of our department, or they're receiving services through the foster care system, which is also federally funded. So I don't think that funding is a barrier for us.
It reminds me the first time I approached the education committee of our statewide judges that they needed to be educated about human trafficking. They said, what do I care about human trafficking? What do I need? I'm a civil judge. What do I care? And I pointed out that they didn't know what they didn't know, and I'm glad to report that we've had a number of statewide and focused education. But the reality is that everybody is at risk. Yeah. If they are in the child, and that's the education. Tell them to read the ACEs study. There's the Opinionator in the New York Times last week did a fabulous blog about, we have all of these children that have been trauma exposed. We know the science of it. Why are we not putting our resources in that? So it's a matter of reallocating our resources and making sure that we have properly trained individuals. That is key. We're wasting our money because we have people that have no trauma-informed education, that are doing assessments, that don't know how to ask questions, that are doing it at the wrong time, the wrong questions, and don't have relationships, when all we need is to have the properly educated individuals do it and shift the money, and then we will save. And there's all sorts of statistics on how that will save.
I just had one last thought when you were talking. So Catherine Chong was here earlier from the Administration for Children and Families, and I think it's hard for the child welfare agencies to say today, I don't have this problem or I'm not familiar with it, because the federal government is giving us guidance now, right, on how to work on it. And so I think we're hopefully in a new place.
And the CDC says that it's an epidemic.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your work.
Okay. Hi, thank you for your time. My name is Jennifer Bruno, and I'm a survivor of kidnapping. I was hanging out on the streets and was kidnapped and sexually abused, and since then have dedicated a lot of my time to researching best practices within aftercare and trauma-informed care and somatic psychology, and sharing these works and trying to collaborate with others. And I was very excited coming here today, and this morning on the the news brief. What's that called?
The press conference.
That they talked about demand, because one of the things that's completely mind-boggling in my world was there's people that do this to people and why, and it's just something in understanding oppression and understanding why there's a demand to this supply. And I'm just curious to hear how your programs are including this in your outreach and your education and just talking about it.
That's a great question.
Okay. I heard the FBI mentioned that the most common denominator among pimps is that 87% of the people that they questioned that were pimps came from violent households. So, of course, it's my opinion that we can actually prevent the demand and prevent the victimization if we will do what we have laws to do, what we've been educated to do. We've come a long way with domestic violence, but we have to come farther. And so if we can have the mandate that there be batterers program, mandate that the children that are exposed are getting the appropriate counseling so that they don't grow up to do that. And those are they either become, I'm not saying they all become, but that's a pretty significant, frightening statistic. But we also know that the children that are raised in these households are the ones that are having all of the brain development issues and are becoming vulnerable to victimization. So if we can intervene early, even if we know there's DV, then we can have trauma-informed care and proper counseling, then we may prevent it. That, from my perspective, that's all that I can do. If I were a criminal judge, which I can be and I have been, and we need to encourage education to not drop these charges. But what we failed to do, I think, is educate state prosecutors. I am tired of state prosecutors, partially because they don't approach victims correctly, dropping cases because they say they don't have cooperation. If you're familiar with WOW, which is Wider Opportunities for Women, they have developed a phenomenal handbook to help prosecutors approach the victims properly so they can prosecute to the full extent of the law. I don't want another domestic violence case dropped down to disorderly conduct and anger management, because that's part of the problem too.
Great, thank you. And just in the interest of time, I just want to, just get to our last questions real quick, if you don't mind.
My name is Barbara Odekirk, and I'm the American Psychological Association Science Fellow placed at the National Institute of Justice. And I've done some work with girls in the juvenile justice system, and one thing I often heard from the women themselves, but also practitioners, law enforcement, is that it doesn't happen in one place usually. The girls are trafficked across borders, they're trafficked across, they go from Virginia to California, they go back to Virginia. There's so many different places, and everyone today has talked a lot about how there's so much diversity in how the cases are handled across states. And so I'm just wondering how this comes into play when you find someone in California that should be in Virginia. How do you deal with that, both from the service provision side but also from the legal side?
Well, we heard a little bit earlier about the interstate compact on juveniles, and I know we don't have any law enforcement representatives on the panel, but we work very closely with the FBI, and it seemed, my understanding is that they are communicating with each other across states and will go to other states, and they actually seem to know who a lot of these youth are who are being moved across states, and so I think that kind of informs some of the work they do, because oftentimes when they call us, when they're picking someone up, they'll say, we knew this kid, she was here in New Jersey, she went to Virginia, now she's back, and so I think law enforcement is probably doing a better job of tracking it than we are in the social service system.
And I would also mention the National Center. So I think the key is sharing information. And as our systems develop and evolve, we've heard from Phoenix, we've heard from a number of areas, as they get better at recognizing this and develop those collaborations, we'll get stronger in responding across state lines. But in the meantime, there's organizations, there's groups, there's FBI that can help us connect those dots.
Great. You want to finish?
I was trying really hard to be quiet. But you mentioned demand, and I felt heat go up my back. I really think there needs to be stiffer penalties for pimps and exploiters, but even more for the Johns. because I think that we talk a lot about, and we work really hard, and we talk a lot about what we do, and we skip over demand, and we minimize, and we don't want to say it. But the reason why there's no money is because a lot of the people that have the power buy the sex. So I was trying to be good. I was trying really hard to be good. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And we're right up at 5 o'clock, so I want to be...
One just quick comment.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Donna Hughes, and I'm from the University of Rhode Island. And I really wanted to thank the survivor that brought up the question of the demand. And I really want to thank Anne for pointing out that we have not yet talked about the sex buyers at all today. And they do create the demand.
Thanks,
Great,
Donna.
thank
I use
you.
your research all the time.
Thank you. And thank you to our panel for your diverse perspectives and your very thoughtful answers. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I am charged with just wrapping up a few key themes and talking about next steps. I know we're getting close to the end, but I just did want to add an anecdote. I think we were charged by many of the people here, and it was discussed that these kind of gatherings are the opportunity to learn from each other. And so I hope that for us, when Casey Family Programs, the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges, and Shared Hope were planning for this colloquium, we talked a lot about how can we be strategic and smart and having the right people to actually create learning and dialogue for the wealth of expertise in our audience, right? And I really think that that happened. I want to thank you all so much for both of our panels for allowing that to happen. A few of the themes, looking at that theme, one of the things that I really appreciated from the panelists was honesty, right? That they were willing to be honest about the challenges that we face, but not scared to talk about what those solutions look like. And 2 years ago, when we first came up with this idea of the colloquium, we brought together leaders, many of whom are here in the audience. A few of you were in the panel that came to our July meeting, and maybe the only tougher thing than trying to create learning dialogue is trying to facilitate a conversation with 30 impassioned anti-trafficking advocates to talk about what we need. But the funny thing about that conversation was when we were talking about shelter and services, we ended with a question say, okay, well, what does success look like and how do we measure it? And the group went silent. And I think that leads to the other theme, right? We're trying to come up with solutions and services for a population of kids who share a trauma but are very different in a lot of ways. And what I've been so impressed by the panel and the theme of this panel is that even though we need mandated system responses and we need real system responses, that doesn't mean that our kids have to fit into that every way. And I really think that's an impressive theme, was the willingness to collaborate among these organizations, among these systems, to make sure that everybody's treated and trained so that we can treat these individual youth in a service-informed manner that will empower them as individuals. So with that said, we are going to be working hard together to make sure that we capture this dialogue in a resource that we can distribute to all of you. We'll be having some follow-up meetings, and we'll also be following Twitter, #SharingTheHope, if there are additional comments. We have those resources available to you on your way out, the flowcharts we mentioned that will go over your own state law and policy, so you can bring that back to work on your own system change. So I encourage you to grab a copy, and thank you so much for joining us today.